The Allies sent millions of people to their deaths, not during the war, after it. Between 1944 and 1947, American and British soldiers, at gunpoint, forced over 2 million men, women, and children onto trucks and trains heading east, into Stalin's hands. Mothers drowned their own children in an Austrian river rather than be taken. Men begged to be shot. Prisoners were drugged unconscious and loaded onto Soviet ships. And the agreement that authorized all of this, it never once used the word force. This is what happened, and what could have happened instead. By the spring of 1945, there are over 5 million Soviet citizens scattered across Western-controlled Europe. And they're not one group. They're 3 very different groups, with 3 very different stories. First, you've got roughly 4 million Ostarbeiter, civilian workers, many of them women and teenagers, dragged out of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia to work in German factories, farms, and mines. They didn't choose to be there. They were forced labor. Second, about 2 million Red Army soldiers who survived the nightmare of German POW camps. Camps where, let's be clear, over 3 million Soviet prisoners had already died from starvation, disease, and outright murder. The ones still alive in 1945 are the survivors of one of the worst atrocities of the entire war. And then there's the third group, the smallest but the most controversial. A few 100,000 men who put on German uniforms and fought against the Soviet Union, Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army, Cossack cavalry units under a German general named Helmuth von Panwitz, various Osttruppen scattered across Wehrmacht divisions. Some were ideological anti-communists. Some were desperate prisoners who saw a German uniform as the only alternative to starving to death in a POW cage. And some, honestly, were genuine collaborators. Now here's what makes this story so twisted. Stalin considers all 3 groups traitors, every single one of them. The Ostarbeiter, contaminated by Western influence. The POWs, cowards who should have fought to the death. That's literally what Order 270 says. Surrender equals treason, punishable by execution. And the men in German uniforms? Obviously traitors to the motherland. But Stalin has a problem. He can't publicly admit that entire divisions of Soviet citizens switched sides and fought for Germany. That would shatter the propaganda myth of a unified Soviet motherland. So when the Allied Supreme Headquarters asks Moscow what to do with all the Soviet nationals they're capturing in Normandy, the Soviets just deny it. They flatly deny that any of their citizens went over to the enemy. Meanwhile, nearly 30,000 Soviet nationals in German uniforms are sitting in Allied POW cages across France and Belgium. And Stalin holds one very powerful card. By early 1945, the Red Army has liberated somewhere between 50 and 60,000 American and British prisoners from German camps in Eastern Europe, and he is in no hurry to send them home. So at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sit down and sign a repatriation agreement. All Soviet citizens found in Western zones will be returned to the Soviet Union. All Western prisoners found in Soviet zones will be returned to the West. Sounds fair, right? A simple prisoner exchange. Except it wasn't simple, and it wasn't fair. Because here's what most people don't know. I want you to actually hear this. The text of the Yalta Repatriation Agreement, the actual document signed on February 11, 1945, never uses the word force. Not once. It says liberated citizens will be handed over. It says both sides will facilitate repatriation. That's it. Forced repatriation. The bayonets, the tear gas, the mass suicides. All of that was an interpretation. A choice, not a treaty obligation. And it gets worse. The forced returns didn't even start at Yalta. Britain had already shipped over 10,000 people from Liverpool to the Soviet port of Murmansk on October 31, 1944. 4 full months before the conference even happened. Yalta didn't create the policy. It just gave legal cover to something that was already underway. Now, inside the American government, there was a real fight over this. Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew wrote a memo just 10 days before Yalta, arguing that these people were captured in German uniforms, and the Geneva Convention does not permit you to look behind the uniform to determine questions of citizenship. Attorney General Francis Biddle called it a violation of the time-honored rule of asylum. Secretary of War Henry Stimson refused to sign the forced repatriation letter, warning, and I'm paraphrasing here, that America would end up responsible for a mass killing by the Russians. 3 senior officials, 3 clear objections, all overruled. So here's the question this video is going to answer. What if they hadn't been overruled? What if Truman, who took office just 2 months later and was far more suspicious of Stalin than Roosevelt ever was? What if Truman had looked at the Yalta text, seen that it never mentioned force, and simply said no? What happens next might surprise you, because the answer isn't a simple happy ending. It's something far more complicated and far more relevant to the world we live in right now. Now, before we get into the simulation, quick thing. Alexander Solzhenitsyn called this the last secret of World War II. The U.S. Army classified the key documents top secret in 1948. Julius Epstein spent 20 years fighting the government just to get them declassified. This story was buried on purpose. If you think it deserves to be heard, you know what to do. All right, let's get into it. Okay, here's the scenario. It's April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt dies. Harry Truman, a man who privately called Stalin a liar and openly distrusted the Soviet Union, steps into the Oval Office. Within weeks, Truman's advisors brief him on the repatriation situation, and what they tell him is ugly. American soldiers at camps across Germany are refusing to carry out orders. Men are killing themselves rather than be loaded onto trucks. Women are drowning their own children. And the legal basis for all of it? An agreement that, as the State Department's own internal memo admits, makes no provision whatsoever to use force. In our timeline, Truman inherited Roosevelt's policy and let it continue. The forced returns accelerated through the summer and fall of 1945. But in this simulation, Truman makes a different call. He adopts what the State War-Navy Coordinating Committee internally labeled Interpretation B. The Yalta Agreement only requires the United States to facilitate voluntary repatriation. It does not obligate the use of force. America will open the door, but it will not push anyone through it. Now, what does Stalin do? This is the part everyone wants to jump to, and the answer is grimmer than you might expect. Because Stalin has hostages. Roughly 23,000 American and 30,000 British servicemen are in Soviet-controlled territory, liberated from German POW camps by the Red Army, but not yet returned home. And declassified documents make it crystal clear that Stalin was already using them as leverage. Here's a detail that genuinely shocked me when I found it. In early February 1945, during the Yalta Conference itself, the Soviets arranged for about 130 American airmen imprisoned at Tashkent to be quietly released. The group left the Soviet Union via Tehran on February 14th. That's 3 days after General Dean signed the repatriation agreement. 3 days. The timing was not a coincidence. Those airmen were bargaining chips, and the receipt of payment was the repatriation deal. So, in our alternate timeline, the moment Truman announces voluntary-only repatriation, Stalin's first move is obvious. He slows down, or outright freezes, the return of Western prisoners, not publicly. He wouldn't make a dramatic announcement. He'd just let things get complicated. Paperwork delays, transportation problems, medical quarantines that drag on for weeks. The same passive-aggressive obstruction the Soviets had already been practicing throughout 1945. And this creates an agonizing dilemma for Truman. Every day he holds firm on voluntary repatriation. American families are writing to Congress demanding to know why their sons haven't come home. The political pressure is enormous. This is exactly why Roosevelt's team caved in the first place. Not because they believed forced repatriation was legal or moral, but because they were terrified of what Stalin would do to their own people. But here's what makes this scenario different from what actually happened. And this is the part most people miss. Stalin's hostage leverage had an expiration date. By late 1945, most Allied POWs had already found their way home through various channels. Through Odessa, through direct transfers, through sheer individual determination. The longer Truman delays, the fewer hostages Stalin has left. Every week that passes, the leverage weakens. And there's a precedent that proves this could work. Not from a superpower, from a country of 12,000 people. Liechtenstein. Population 12,141. No army. A police force of 11 men. On May 2, 1945, 462 soldiers of General Boris Smyslovsky's First Russian National Army crossed the border into Liechtenstein with their families, 30 women and 2 children. On August 16th, a Soviet delegation showed up and demanded them back. Liechtenstein said no. Prime Minister Alexander Frick, backed by Prince Franz Joseph II, refused to hand over a single person. The principality fed and housed the refugees at 30,000 Swiss francs per month for 2 years. About 200 of the group eventually chose to return to the Soviet Union voluntarily. Nothing was ever heard from them again. The rest were resettled in Argentina. A monument at Hinterschellenberg still marks the spot where they crossed. A country with 11 policemen told Stalin no, and Stalin blinked. So the question becomes, what happens when a superpower does the same thing? Let's fast forward. It's the summer of 1945. Truman has drawn the line, voluntary repatriation only. Stalin is furious, but hasn't escalated to open confrontation. The Western POW situation is tense but manageable. And now the real question shifts, from geopolitics to something much messier. What do you do with 2 million people who have nowhere to go? Because that's the reality on the ground. Across Germany and Austria, the displaced persons camps are overflowing. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, is already struggling to manage millions of refugees from across Europe. Now add another 1 to 2 million Soviet citizens who, in this scenario, are no longer being forced east. The camps are not pleasant places. They're former military barracks, converted warehouses, sometimes repurposed concentration camps, including Dachau. People are sleeping on straw, disease is rampant, food is rationed, and the psychological damage is staggering. These are people who survived German forced labor, German POW camps, and now they're living behind wire again, in limbo, belonging to no country. But here's where something remarkable starts to happen. Because in our timeline, this actually played out, just 2 years later and with fewer people. In the real history, about 1 million displaced persons, the so-called last million, refused to go home. They resisted, hid, destroyed their papers, claimed different nationalities. Ukrainians claiming Polish citizenship jumped from 9,200 in December 1945 to 107,000 by June 1947. People were forging documents, lying about their birthplace, doing whatever it took to avoid being sent back to Stalin. In our alternate timeline, this happens on a much larger scale, and it happens immediately. Instead of a slow trickle of resistance building over 2 years, you get a flood, and the West has to deal with it head-on. Now, and this is something I find fascinating, the legal tools to handle this already existed. They just weren't being used. Remember the Galician Division? 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division, sitting in a camp in Rimini, Italy. In our timeline, they were saved by a legal technicality. The British ruled that the Yalta Agreement only applied to people who were Soviet citizens as of September 1, 1939. Most of the Galicians came from Polish Galicia, so they were classified as Polish, not Soviet. A British screening officer named Dennis Hills recommended that the entire Ukrainian formation should be treated as a cohesive whole and given the benefit of the doubt. But it didn't stop there. The Vatican intervened directly. Ukrainian Bishop Ivan Buchko appealed to Pope Pius XII, describing the soldiers as good Catholics, and fervent anti-communists. Cardinal Tisserant lobbied Allied authorities. General Władysław Anders, a Polish commander with enormous credibility, vouched for them. The result? 8,570 men were shipped from Venice to Britain in May and June of 1947. General Shandruk later wrote to the Pope, "We were all saved by the apostolic see of your holiness." So the mechanism worked. The September 1939 citizenship test, the diplomatic pressure, the humanitarian appeals. It saved 10,000 people in the real world. In our scenario, Truman applies this same test from the beginning, from February 1945, not late 1945, and the implications are enormous. Think about who this covers, not just the Galicians. Every person from the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940. Every person from Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, taken from Poland in 1939. Every white Russian émigré who left during the Civil War and was never a Soviet citizen in the first place. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people who, under the September 1939 test, would be immediately exempt from repatriation. But here's the mini-twist. Here's the part that complicates the clean moral narrative. Not everyone in the camps is an innocent victim. Among the displaced persons are men who participated in real atrocities. Some Cossack units committed documented war crimes against civilians in Yugoslavia and northern Italy. Some members of the Galician division have been linked to massacres in eastern Poland. Vlasov's officers collaborated with the German military command. And scattered through the camps are former concentration camp guards, local police who assisted in roundups, and informers who sent their neighbors to death. In the real world, the Soviets used this fact ruthlessly. Their argument to the Western Allies was simple: you are sheltering war criminals. And honestly, in some cases, they weren't wrong. So in our alternate timeline, Truman faces a problem that has no clean solution. If you refuse to send anyone back, you protect hundreds of thousands of innocent people, but you also shelter some number of genuine war criminals. And the Soviets will make sure the entire world knows about it. This leads to something that didn't happen quickly enough in the real timeline: a serious, systematic screening process. Instead of blanket repatriation or blanket protection, you'd need individual case review. Who fought willingly for the Germans and who was coerced? Who committed atrocities and who was simply a conscript trying to survive? Who has family waiting in the Soviet Union and genuinely wants to go home? And who faces certain execution if returned? And this is where the story connects to something much bigger than 1945. Because that screening process, the idea that each person's case matters individually, that you can't just ship human beings in bulk based on their passport, that is the foundation of modern refugee law. In our timeline, it took until 1951 for the UN Refugee Convention to enshrine this principle. The core concept, non-refoulement, the prohibition against returning people to places where they face persecution, was born directly from the horrors of Operation Keelhaul. But in our alternate timeline, this conversation starts in 1945, not 1951. 6 years earlier, and every year earlier that conversation starts is tens of thousands of lives that aren't destroyed. Meanwhile, something else is happening on the geopolitical stage that makes this scenario even more surreal. Because at the exact same time that Operation Keelhaul is sending people east in the real timeline, at the exact same time, Winston Churchill has ordered his military planners to draw up Operation Unthinkable, a plan to launch a surprise attack on the Soviet Union, scheduled for July 1, 1945, using British, American, Polish, and even rearmed German forces. Let that sit for a moment. In the summer of 1945, the Western Allies are simultaneously planning a war against Stalin and handing over his victims to keep him happy. The same governments, the same summer, two completely opposite policies running in parallel. In our alternate timeline, where Truman has already drawn the line on repatriation, unthinkable becomes less of a fantasy and more of a contingency. Not because anyone wants to fight, everyone is exhausted, but because the relationship with Moscow is deteriorating faster. The Cold War, which in our timeline crystallized around 1947 with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, begins taking shape in the summer of 1945. And that brings us to the biggest question of all, the one I honestly wasn't sure how to answer when I started researching this. So at this point, most people watching would assume the conclusion is obvious. The West refuses forced repatriation. Hundreds of thousands of people are saved. The moral side wins. End of story. But that's not what would happen. Not entirely. Because here's what the clean version of this story leaves out. The majority of those 5 million Soviet citizens, they wanted to go home. Recent archival research, including work by Soviet-era historian Viktor Zemskov, who spent years inside the declassified NAKVD files, shows that at least 80% of Ostarbeiter and POWs from pre-1939 Soviet borders would have returned voluntarily. They missed their families. They believed the promises of amnesty. Some had children they hadn't seen in 4 years, and many of them simply had nowhere else to go. They didn't speak English. They had no money. They had no connections in the West. Home, even a dangerous home, was the only home they knew. The real crime of Operation Keelhaul was never about repatriation itself. It was about forcing the 20% who said no, the ones who knew what was waiting for them, the ones who begged, who fought, who killed themselves rather than go back. And even in our alternate timeline, even if Truman says voluntary only, here's what still happens to the people who choose to return. They go through filtration. Smersh and the NKVD set up roughly 100 camps along the Soviet border. Every single returnee is photographed, fingerprinted, interrogated. They must recount every detail, how they were captured, what they did in Germany, who they talked to, what they saw. The process can take 2 months, and during those 2 months, many are used as unpaid labor for local industry while being force-fed propaganda. By October 1945, interned repatriates had already listened to 78,000 lectures. Those who pass filtration get travel documents. They go home, but home doesn't want them. Women returnees are called German whores. Communist Party members who stayed in occupied territory, roughly 60,000 of them, are expelled from the party. One district official put it plainly: "We are going to mobilize them and send them off to float timber down the rivers." And those who don't pass, about 6.5% of all returnees, roughly 350,000 people, are arrested during filtration. 14% of returning POWs are handed to the NKVD. Many end up in labor camps. Many die there. The Soviet system doesn't need forced repatriation from the West to destroy these people. It destroys them on arrival regardless. So the twist isn't that refusing repatriation fixes everything. It doesn't. The Soviet machine grinds on whether the West cooperates or not. The real twist is this: refusing forced repatriation saves the people who knew they were doomed. The Vlasov soldiers, the Cossacks, the white émigrés, the Baltic refugees, the political dissidents. The ones with the clearest eyes about what Stalin's regime actually was. And it does something else. Something that echoes far beyond 1945. It establishes a precedent. It draws a line in international law that says, a government does not get to demand its citizens back like lost property. A human being who says, "I am afraid to go home," has the right to be heard. And honestly, when I first researched this, I didn't believe it either. But that legal principle, non-refoulement, the cornerstone of the 1951 Refugee Convention, was born directly from the failure of Operation Keelhaul. The world looked at what happened at Lienz and Plattling and Fort Dix and said, never again. In our alternate timeline, it just says it's 6 years sooner. In 1955, the Soviet Union released several hundred survivors of forced repatriation from the Gulag. They'd been there for 10 years. A Soviet newspaper ran an editorial about it, and I want you to hear what it said. It acknowledged that the sins of the returnees had been forgiven. But then it added this: the English and American bayonets, truncheons, machine guns, and tanks used against them will never be forgotten. No Russian will ever forget Lienz, Dachau, Plattling. Think about that. The Soviets weren't ashamed of what they did to the returnees. They were angry at the West for helping them do it, and they used Operation Keelhaul as anti-Western propaganda for decades. Meanwhile, the West buried the story. The British government destroyed its original file on forced repatriation sometime between 1968 and 1969. The Americans kept their 3 volumes classified top secret for over 20 years. When historian Julius Epstein found the index card for the Keelhaul file in a public catalog at the Army Historical Records Branch in 1954, he was told it shouldn't be there. He spent the next 2 decades, including a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act, just trying to get the documents released. Nobody wanted this story told. But the legacy is everywhere, if you know where to look. The International Refugee Organization, created in 1946. The UN Refugee Convention of 1951. The principle of non-refoulement, now considered customary international law, which says you cannot return a person to a place where they face persecution. Every single one of these was built, brick by brick, from the wreckage of Operation Keelhaul. And today, at the end of 2024, there are 123.2 million forcibly displaced people on this planet. That's the combined population of Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, and Austria. All of them homeless. Every one of those people is protected, at least in theory, by a legal framework that exists because of what happened in the camps of Austria and Germany 80 years ago. The tools to refuse were there in 1945. The legal arguments existed. The moral case was obvious. 3 senior American officials said so out loud. A country with 11 policemen proved it could be done. But the great democracies chose expediency over principle, and somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people paid for that choice with their lives. The question Operation Keelhaul leaves us with isn't really about 1945. It's about every moment a government has to choose between what is easy and what is right, and whether anyone is paying attention when they make that choice. This is a What If Wars alternate history analysis. The historical events described are documented and sourced. You'll find the full source list in the description below. The alternate history simulation is speculative and represents one plausible scenario, not a prediction. If this is the kind of deep dive history you want more of, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.